Hi there. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. I'm Laura from the Comstock Park branch, and we have a great program lined up for you tonight, exploring what we can do about racism with special guest Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige, who is the Executive Associate to the President for Diversity and Inclusion over at Calvin University. So find yourself a comfy spot and settle in. Welcome, Dr. Michelle. Thank you so much for being here tonight and to talk about this very important topic.
It's my pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. All right. Well, if you're ready, let's go ahead and dive right in.
All right, let's go. So, hello, everyone. I am so glad to be here with you this evening. And so we're going to talk about racism specifically. In this season, people often ask me, but what can I do about racism? But I want to remind you of a quote by Dr. Bonilla Silva, who says that to go beyond race, you have to go through race. So before we can actually talk about racism, we're going to have to go through race. Race is not often a subject that people really want to talk about. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. You just kind of ignore it. There's a different part to it. But racism is something that we really should be talking about now. But why talk about it and how do we talk about it? Well, we talk about it because it is something that impacts each and every one of us. It doesn't matter your race or ethnicity. Race is something that we all have. It could be something that we're very proud of and we talk about a lot, or it just could be something that's, just a part of our identity. It's just a part of who we are, but we don't really think much about it. Whether you talk a lot about your race, whether you think about your race or celebrate your race, however you feel about your race, you still have a race. We all live in a racialized body, and we live in a racialized community in a racialized world. How we interact with this world is really impacted by our racial identities. So we need to talk about race. But how do we talk about race? Well, we begin talking about race by understanding what race actually is. Race is a social rather than a biological construction. What this means is that race is more than just the skin color or the texture of our hair or our color of our eyes. Race is more social than it is biological. We tend to put people into racialized categories by what our eyes see. But what our eyes see isn't necessarily how someone understands their own racial identity. There's nothing significant biologically about a person in terms of their racial identity. It's more how they see themselves and how others in the world see them. Race is this theoretical invention of a European scientist used to separate and rank human beings into three distinct biological categories: the Caucasoids, the Negroids, and the Mongoloids. Those are not categories that we use anymore, but that's the basis of all the racial categories that we have right now. The term race is applied to humans, was invented to equivalent to the term species used to reference non-human animals and plants. So race is this big umbrella type term, right? That it's this big category that is used to minimize ethnic variation and to emphasize these broader group identity markers that are often rooted in appearance, in skin tone, and homelands or origins. So race is this social construction. It's the way we understand who we are and the way we understand who others are. It's not just biology. In fact, it's much more than biology. It is social. Now, how do we get to racism from race, right? So if we're going to know how to deal with racism, we're going to have to understand what is the significance of race. Well, as I said earlier, we live in a racialized world, and in our way of living and operating, we often run into bias or run into prejudice. Now, bias is this way of looking at someone or looking at something. A bias can be negative or positive. Now, myself, I love red apples. Honeycrisp are okay, but give me a solid red apple as opposed to a green one, and I'll be happy. Especially if we're talking apples and oranges. I'd rather have an apple than an orange. I'm not allergic to apples or oranges. I just have a preference. So you can think of bias as having a preference. Prejudice is an assumption of knowledge about something or someone that's not rooted in personal experience, right? So a prejudice is our way of thinking about groups of people, just as biases are kind of leaning or orientation towards or away from people. Now, to get from race to racism, right? We've talked about bias, we've talked about prejudice. Racism is more about the stereotypes about the differences and inferiority. It is the use of power to exclude and discriminate, right? So what are some things we need to think about? We need to think about attitudes. We need to think about behaviors. And most importantly, we need to think about structures. So when we are looking at racism, remember we talked about prejudice. Prejudice is the attitude, and then discrimination is the behavior. So when we treat someone differently based on the prejudice that is based on a bias about someone's race, we are getting closer and closer to practices that will lead to inequality. Racism, the outcome of it, is the inequality that people experience based on their race, right? So the differential treatment that people have. How do we get here? How do we get to this place where some races are viewed more highly, other races are used more negatively? How do we have prejudices against some people, and how are they instilled in our heads so that they are practiced almost effortlessly? Well, we can take a look at history. With history, think of it as this cumulative impacts of practices, right? So if we look at our history, if we look at all that has gone on before us, if we looked at what happened in 1619, and then we look at what happened in 1800, and then we look at what happened in the 1900s. Well, it sounds funny to say 1900s were so long ago, but look at what happened in the 1900s. Look at what happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right? So we have history, but we have the momentum of history. It's not just something that happened way back then. It's what happened way back then and those waves that are still going on from that history, from that something that happened way back then. So history has something to tell us about the foundations of privilege and oppression in the United States. We look at the laws that had happened, right? And then we look at culture. Culture is this way that we live our lives, right? It's this rules for behavior. It's kind of the roadmap to how we live life. What culture does is normalize and replicate these differences and privilege and oppression, right? So history tells us and sets up privilege and oppression, and culture normalizes it. It replicates it. And I don't know how clearly you can see, but the little image that I have next to culture is this plaque for drinking fountains. One is for whites and one is for coloreds. For those of you who were around in the 50s and 60s, you might have even seen one of these signs. That's an example of how privilege and oppression being built into the culture and being normalized. It was normal in some parts of the United States for drinking fountains and all other public spaces and places to be segregated, right? And not only was it kind of the normal way of life, and you just kind of knew your place in society, but it was also enforced and supported by the laws and various agencies and institutions. And so this is where we get to the next point, this interconnected institutions and policies, right? So we have these ways of understanding our lives, the ways that we negotiate culture and community, that's culture. But then we have various institutions and policies that reinforce this. So whether it's the laws about who you can bring charges up against, where you can live, right? That's where redlining comes in. where you can go to school, what kind of job that you can have. All of that is a part of understanding how we get from race to racism. And then finally, we have racial and racialized ideologies, these ideas and these myths that perpetuate racial hierarchies, right? So we have these ideas or we thoughts, right? It could be the way that we interpret scripture. It could be other myths, origin myths about and the place of people, the hierarchy. All of that is included. So you combine history and culture, reinforce it with institutional policies and institutions that are interconnected with one another. So where you live has a big impact on where you go to school. Where you live has an impact on your access to healthcare. Where you live has an impact on access to libraries and access to good food. Where you go to school has an impact on the type of job that you're going to be able to have. So all of these are interconnected. So what happens with racism? Why is racism such a bad thing? I'm sure I don't have to explain that to you, but let me present it in this way. Racism, what it does, it disempowers and controls the people against whom it is directed, right? So when we think about individual and personal acts, someone doing something to another, this is what racism does. But individuals make up systems. So when systems or organizations or institutions, if individuals who have biases and prejudice use their positions of authority to discriminate against people, they have the power to disempower and to control the people from who their actions are directed. Racism also allocates power and privilege to the dominant racial group by fostering systems and structures that serve the economic, cultural, and psychological interests of that group. Think about it a minute, right? So on the first level of racism, what racism does is it disempowers and it controls people. It limits what people can do. The second is that, you have this oppressed group, you have this underrepresented group or this marginalized group, but you can't have a marginalized group unless you have a privileged group. So racism also serves to allocate power and privilege to whoever the dominant racial group is. And again, we're talking about categories of people. It doesn't mean that each and every individual within a particular category, we'll say the marginalized category, is disempowered or lacks control over various aspects of their life. And we're also not saying that each and every single person in the dominant group can experience their privilege in a way that it advantages them in each and every situation. So we're talking about wide groups. We're talking about trends within groups of people. And finally, racism that is institutionalized, that is racism that is built into the very fabric of how we live our lives, the very fabric of our institutions, whether it's the media, the education system, the healthcare system. It has the potential to imprison both the dominant groups and the minority groups, remember? Because you can't have an oppressed group without having a privileged group. So what racism does, it impacts everyone at a deep psychological, and I would even say a deep spiritual level as well. So when we're looking at racism and trying to figure out what is this thing that's racism, all right, we know about bias, we know about privilege, we know about prejudice, we know about discrimination, but how do we put our hands about, so what is racism? How is that different from some of those other things? Well, in some ways, it's kind of like a number of blind people who are, trying to figure out what an elephant is, and they are all at different parts of the elephant, right? So you have the person who's, touching the ear saying, this is a fan. And you have a person touching the tusk saying, this is a spear. Or someone who is touching the trunk and say, it's a snake. Or someone touching the leg and say, this is a tree. or this is a rope, or this is a wall. What we're trying to say, or what I'm trying to say, how we understand racism depends on the place we are engaging with racism, right? So racism is kind of like, as I said, this image that we have before you, where you have these different people trying to figure out what this animal is or what this thing is, but they're blindfolded and they all have different points of engagement. So let's take this to racism, how we figure this out. There is the micro level, that is kind of the interpersonal or the personal, and then there is the macro level. If we're at the micro level of racism, we can look at internalized, and this is what happens within individuals, whether it is for the majority, this kind of internalized racial superiority, or for the marginalized, this internalized racial inferiority. It can be interpersonal. Interpersonal is how we interact with other individuals, right? So how we behave, how we engage with one another. But then there is the macro level. And from my vantage point, it is the macro level that is the most significant and has the greatest amount of impact and does the greatest amount of harm. So we have the institutional, which is the replication of patterns and bias. We talked about that earlier. And then we also have the structural. The structural is the bigger context where all of this comes together. So institutional are how an institution, as I said before, how the healthcare system, how the criminal justice system, how the media, how faith traditions, how various institutions replicate patterns and biases that support racism, prejudice, and bias. But structural is when all of these institutions are knitted together, and that creates the bigger context for all these forms, for the institutional, for the internalized, and the interpersonal. Now, you might be saying about now, okay, I thought you were going to tell me about what we could do about racism. I am, we're getting there. But in order to understand what we can do about racism, we have to understand how racism manifests. What does it look like? Because if I say, oh, we're going to do something about racism, but I'm only talking about the internalized, or my solutions are only about the internalized aspects of racism, that means that the interpersonal, the institutional, and the structural elements of racism haven't even been dealt with. So for me, how we define the problem is the way that we define our solution or come up with our solutions. So I always like to give a bit of an overview or a bit of a grounding too on what racism looks like, so that we have a better understanding of what we can do about racism. Now, racism is a costly problem, right? And you get that when we talked about those 3 levels of racism. But racism seriously influences our daily reality, as well as the hopes and the dreams that we have for the future. The price of racism affects individual lives, how we interact with each other, and how we are able to navigate societal systems and institutions. Racism isn't just about someone's hurt feelings. Racism isn't just about someone being called a bad name, or someone being a racial slur being used against someone. Racism is costly because it impacts our lives, it impacts how we interact with others, and it also impacts how we navigate the societal systems and institutions. And so I have this question for you. And the question is, where are you in your own approach to racism? For me, there's about 3 zones that we can be in. There's this fear zone, which I don't want to deal with it. It's too touchy. I'm afraid I might offend someone. And I would just rather be comfortable, and conversations about racism just make me uncomfortable. That's in the fear zone. Let me tell you, if you're in the fear zone, you're not going to be able to do very much to help end racism, because really you're not focused on anyone else but yourself. In order to do something about racism, you have to be concerned about other people, because it's more than just about you. So if you're in the fear zone, then we want to move you over at least to the learning zone. And the learning zone is when you are able to recognize that racism is something that needs to be addressed. It's when your eyes are open and you be able to see the impact that racism has, not only on the marginalized people, but the impact that racism also has on the people who are privileged as well. So in the learning zone, it's really you're deepening your understanding and awareness of racism and how it impacts everyone. And then the growth zone. The growth zone is where you take the learning that you have and you begin to speak out about what you see. You begin to embrace this discomfort, because the more you get into understanding racism, you're going to get uncomfortable. The more uncomfortable the discomfort, you embrace that and you decide that you want to do something. You really want to do something about it. And so now we get to, if you want to do something about it, what is it that you can do? Well, this is where I'm saying, you know what, let's look at what you can do as an individual. Now, we can address the interpersonal and the cultural and the systemic, but before you can do that, there are some things that individuals can do as well. And so here we go. I'm going to start off with talking about what white identifying people can do. And so what I mean by white identifying people, these are people who identify themselves as having a white racial identity. And this information I'm sharing with you comes out of a little project booklet by Damalia Ayo. And she asked 2,000 people about she asked about 2,000 people to name 5 things that people could do to end racism. And when she got all this information back, she created this little booklet as a project. And then she divided the contents into 2 sections. One section for white identifying people and the other section for people of color. So I'm going to first start with the white identifying people, and then I'm going to move into the people of color. So white identifying people, what are some things that you can do with racism? Well, first, so important, you have to admit that racism exists. Not everyone understands racism, but I would say, admit that racism exists. Admit that some people have a different experience that you do, that not everyone experiences navigating the social institutions and society with the same ease. And again, we're talking about in general, right? Because we also, if we get deeper into a conversation about race and racialized identities, we have to talk about the intersectionality, right? So what does it mean to be white and female? Or what does it mean to be Black and male, right? So if we had more time, we would talk about the intersectionalities. But at this intro level, we're just going to look at the basics. And in this basic part, admitting that racism is real, admit that you have a race, admit that whiteness is not the same thing as, how do I want to put this? That when we experience that in experiencing whiteness, comes out of this white racial identity. And what I mean by whiteness, remember how we talked about culture being normalized in terms of how we interact with one another, what seems comfortable or normal to us? That's what I mean by whiteness. In the United States, whiteness is the normative. Various ways of understanding the world, understanding community, understanding how we do our practices is generally originates out of this sense of whiteness that is associated with white identifying people. So admit that you have a race, admit that whiteness is normalized, admit that racism is real. That's one step for white identifying people. And then I would say, listen to people who are not like you. Listen to various news outlets. Listen to people who are speaking up to saying, there's some injustices that are along the way. This is what it's like for my group of people. This is what it's like for my group of people. But listen before you are speaking up. Listen before you try to present your biases or your prejudice as being what is actually true or what lines up with the facts, what lines up with the statistics, but listening to what's going on. The next step is educating yourself. And in educating yourself, find out what is actually going on. In the times that we are living in right now, it is so polarized, and you can find yourself only listening to things that support your bias and your prejudices. And I would say diversify your news source, diversify your reading material, diversify your social media feeds, but educate yourself. Look at research that has actually been done and not just opinions of other people. So really educate yourself about history. Educate yourself about social institutions. Educate yourself about the experience of people who don't look like you. Now, this next step, broaden your experience. I want to say with broaden your experience that you have to reach out beyond your comfort zone. But before you do that, I'd want to say that it's important to first realize that you have a race, that racism is real, that people have different experiences, people of color have different experiences, that you have been listening to a diversified group of people to get an idea of what is going on and the experiences of other people, and that you have begun educating yourself, not asking other people to teach you, but you have begun educating yourself by reading, reading up on history, reading up about the state of a community, reading up about the state of different people of color groups, educating yourself. And then when you've begun doing all of that, stepping into broadening your experience. Put yourself in some unusual places, right? Try different things, go different places. Find people that you can have conversations with who might think a little differently than you, or who might have racialized identities who are a little bit different than you, or a lot different than you, either way. But these are some things that you can do, but it's important that in doing this, that you enter into these situations with a posture of cultural humility. And that's why it's important to admit it, to listen and educate yourself before you step into those spaces where you're broadening your experience to interact with people. And then taking action. Because once you know something, and once you know that things aren't quite right, because racism is just pointing out that things are not right, then do something. Do something that is consistent with your sphere of influence. Do something that is consistent with your moral convictions. Do something that is consistent with the way that you would hope the world and your community would be, but do something. It would be a shame to gain all this information, to have an understanding about the disparities that are in our communities. It would be unfortunate to gain an understanding of the experiences of your Black, brown, yellow, red brothers and sisters, that they are suffering, that they are wounded, that oppression and racism is still real, and then come to the conclusion, well, it's not my problem, so I don't have to do anything about it. It's really important. If you want to do something about racism, you have to take action. It could be prayer, it could be signing petitions, it could be doing things that are within your sphere of influence. For example, if you are working in an organization and you know some of the hiring practices are biased, have a conversation with the supervisor or the hiring managers to see if you can't correct the bias that is within those hiring practices. If you know that the community that you're in is treating various racial and ethnic groups unfairly, writing your officials, showing up at city hall meetings, writing the governor, writing your state representatives to say, you know what, this is an unfair practice. We need to do something about it. So taking action means taking all of this that you understand because you have admitted it, you've listened, you've educated yourself, you've broadened your experience. So your knowledge is not just book knowledge. Your knowledge is also looking at from people that you know. So this becomes something that's personal to you. You're at a place now where you can take action. And in taking action, it means that you believe racism is something you can do something about. Even just taking a step in that direction is better than doing nothing at all. But the work of fixing racism isn't just for white identifying people. We also want to take a look at BIPOC. And so what BIPOC means, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, right? So what do people of color, people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or some other racial category, what can you do to fix racism? Because racism is often directed towards us. I say us because I identify as an African-American woman. So racism is often something that's directed towards us. So what is something that we can do so that we're not always the victim? Well, first, we need to get real. Just like white identifying people need to admit it, we too need to get real. We need to understand the impact that racism has on us. We need to be honest about its impact because too often, especially in workplace settings, we kind of go along to get along, and we diminish or we say, maybe it's not impacting me so much because I didn't get stopped by the police. I don't think I was followed when I went into the grocery store. I don't think anyone was saying I couldn't live in a particular place or couldn't work in a particular place because of my race. In this case, we need to better understand the impact on racism for everyone that's within our social category. So we need to get real. We need to understand the impact of racism, and we need to be honest about how it is impacting us. Next thing we can do is to speak out. We need to say something. Like I was saying a little bit earlier, it's like sometimes when something happens, it's like, I don't know if I want to deal with it. So I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to keep my head down and I'm just going to go along to get along. I had to be able to speak out. And that's what we've been seeing. I think these past few months, from the summer to now, we see so many protests that are out there about people who are speaking up, saying enough is enough. Racism has been in place in this nation since people of color, well, I want to say since people of color were brought here, but even before then, right? Because there were the white people who came to this country, found the indigenous population here. So racism has been around for a while, but it's time to speak out, to say, wait, this interpersonal thing isn't working because of the bias that you're bringing to this. This differential pay isn't working anymore. I can't ignore it. So we need to speak out. So we need to get real about what's going on, and we need to speak out about what's going on. It doesn't always have to be a protest, but sometimes protests are important for moving along the push for justice. We too need to educate ourselves. We need to educate ourselves on our own history. People of color are often products of the same institutions that our white brothers and sisters participate in, and there's not a lot of diversity in the curriculum. So we need to educate ourselves about our own history. We need to educate ourselves about what's going on in the world, we need to educate ourselves about what's going on with other people of color groups as well. So, for example, it's important for me as a Black identifying woman to educate myself about how my Asian brothers and sisters are experiencing community, the type of racism and discrimination and bias and prejudice that they are experiencing, as well as my Native American brothers and sisters and my Hispanic identifying brothers and sisters. And it's just important to educate myself to better understand the experiences of other people of color as well as to understand the history of the country that I live in, to understand the structure, the experiences of the community that I live in. It's important to educate ourselves. And partly this is important so that we realize we're not alone. And that we also understand that there are people that we have things that are in common with and people that we can build ties with. And that takes us to the next point, right? Building ties, building community, building connections with people within our own communities, building ties, building community, building connections with people who look different than us, building ties, building connections, building communities with people who are in position to be able to change things. So it's important to get to know our representatives. It's important to get to know our commissioners and the city representatives. It's important to know these people and to build some connections and to build ties. It's important to know our neighbors. So building ties is also important as well. And then this last step is taking care. It's really important when you are a part of a marginalized group, whether it's on race, and we're talking about race today, could also be experiencing a marginalized identity because of gender, because of socioeconomic class, because of a myriad of all other kind of things. Faith practices, all of these things could make us have us a marginalized identity. When we feel that we are being marginalized because of we're experiencing microaggressions, microaggressions are those little things that happen that remind you that you are not welcome, you don't belong, you're not important, and you don't matter. Those are little microaggressions. Or all the way to the very big, blatant things, those things that systems have the power to do, like you can't live in this neighborhood. They might not tell you, but it's built into the policies, and it's pretty clear that you're not welcome in those places. When we're experiencing all of that, the weight of that, and I would say especially in this season coming through the summer, it is important to take care of yourself. It is important to practice self-care so that you can flourish in spite of all the things that are around to tell you that you should not be flourishing. It is important to take care of yourself so that you can, in a manner of speaking, live to fight another day. Taking care of ourselves is so very important, which means we need to eat right, we need to exercise, we need to get rest, we need to be still at some times just to be able to take care of ourselves, to build community, to do something that is fun and something that enriches us. So we have talked about what individuals can do, what individuals can do in their own personal lives. Now we take these things that white identifying people can do and BIPOC identifying people can do. And as we begin doing these things, we will then have an impact on culture. And when we take what we have learned, we'll be able to look around us and see, you know what? This music that we are playing in the office all the time that's just kind of popped in, it's really only geared for one kind of people. The people who, and then to ask the question, so if this music that is piped in really is only for one kind of people, do we really want diversity? Do we really want inclusion? Are we privileging some as opposed to another. You say, well, is music racist? Well, I'm not saying that music is racist. I'm just saying if we take what we have learned and we become aware that our cultures replicate patterns of privilege and patterns of oppression, that we as individuals have ideas and biases and prejudice. When that gets built into the way that we do things, that gets built into our culture, and when we begin educating ourselves, when we begin admitting it, listening, speaking out, building ties, building communities, we'll be able to see things in the culture that we never saw before. And as we see those things, we take those actions based on what we have learned as individuals to reshape our culture, so that if we are people who really want to see diversity, that we really value the diversity, that we value what everyone brings to the table, that we value community, that we value inclusion. It means that when we look at our culture, we'll begin questioning, why are things the way that they are? Why aren't there any people of color in this space? And then once we ask the question honestly, we get beyond, well, they just don't want to be here. Is it true that they just don't want to be here? Or is it because it doesn't feel like they're welcome? What are the images that are on the walls? What music is being played? What is the service like? If you're in a retail kind of space or in a service-oriented kind of space, what is the reception like? If you're a white identifying person, are you more comfortable with other white people and less comfortable with people of color? And does that show? Right? So we look at the culture and we begin to change those things in the culture to say, no, we're going to celebrate diversity. And not only are we going to celebrate diversity because we want different people to be involved, because they have much to bring to the table, but we're going to find ways to include that diversity in what we do. And not only are we going to include that diversity in what we do, but we are also going to build it into our institutions so that diversity, valuing others, becomes normative, so that equity becomes normative, so that inclusion becomes normative. And as we begin taking care of culture, we will then begin taking care of our institutions, right? As we change culture, the media will change. The books that our students, our children read in the classroom will become more inclusive. The curriculum, the things that they are learning about will become more inclusive. U.S. history will be our history, not just the history of white people with a few sprinkles, acknowledgement or nods to some people of color, but it really will be our history. Everyone will have access to healthcare because we'll be paying attention to the people who are left out or who don't have access to healthcare. We'll be paying attention to food deserts and where people don't have good access to food. We'll be paying attention to the educational system and making sure that if we really value everyone, that a good education is accessible by all. Doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter your zip code, doesn't matter your socioeconomic status, but you are able to get a good education. So that's how institutions change. So we say, how do we do something about racism? Well, it starts with yourself, but it doesn't end with yourself. It starts with yourself so that you can begin working on culture and then begin working on institutions. And so, what do you do about racism? Well, you start. You just start. You start somewhere and say, well, I don't know. Well, we find some things to read. I would say a good book to read to start off is, I would recommend The Color of Compromise by Jemar Tisby. The Color of Compromise talks about the complicity of the church in supporting racism, but it's a really good history of how an institution helps support racism in how individuals bring in biases, how cultures support those biases, and how they get built into institutions. And then it helps us to see, oh, this is why we have the type of segregation at 11 o'clock on Sundays that we do, right? So reading something, but I would just say just do something. I love this quote that says, just start where you are, start with fear. I can tell you, as a diversity professional, as a chief diversity officer, doing this work for over 30 years, it is scary entering into conversations with people about race, about inequality, about racism, about privilege. Sometimes just even saying the word, we're going to talk about privilege, has people covering their ears and they don't want to talk about it anymore because they think that you're trying to bash someone over the head or critique them or condemn them. And that's not necessarily what people are trying to do. But we need to start, even if we're afraid to have the conversation. We need to start, even if we're feeling a bit of pain, because if we've been wounded before, it can make us a little afraid to have another conversation or to try to do something different. But sometimes if there's still a little ache in our heart, a little ache in our soul, we still need to start with that, because in my mind, we're never going to be fully healed until we completely eliminate racism and all the other isms that are out there. So if we're waiting until the pain goes away, we'll never start. So start with the pain, start with doubt, start with hands shaking, start with voice trembling, but just start. Start and don't stop. You want to do something about racism? Start where you are. Do something different, educating yourself, and then don't stop. Don't say, well, I read The Color of Compromise, like you said, and I made 3 friends who are different racially from me, and so now I don't have to do anything anymore. No, there is always learning to do. As I said, I've been doing this work for 30 years, and there is still learning that I do. Start where you are with what you have. Just start. I hope that you found something in this presentation interesting and enlightening, that you found an action or two that you could do. If there was something you could do to change the world, I would have included it because I want you to change the world. But the reality is, to do something with racism, you start with yourself. You start looking at your own ideas. You start recognizing your own biases and your own prejudices, no matter who you are, because we all have biases. We all have prejudices. But you start to recognize what those biases and prejudices that you do have. You work to educate yourself to correct those biases and prejudices so that they don't manifest in the way that you interact with other people. They don't manifest when you are in a position to set policies or set the environment for culture within your organization. You start with who you are. You start as an individual. You impact culture. You shape culture. You speak into culture. You address the institutions. And if you can do that, we really will see an end to racism. My friends, that's what you can do to stop racism, but we need to do it together. So I look forward to working with you. I look forward in you doing your part and me doing my part. And if we all do our parts, we will see an end to racism sooner rather than later. I'm Michelle Loyd-Paige from Calvin University. You're muted, Laura.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was such an empowering presentation. I'm taking away a lot of good things, and I hope you all are too. I especially love what you said about broadening your experiences. Like, really just get out there, get out of your bubble, just meet new people, just educate yourself.
Yeah, and it can be a little scary. But I would say, get out there. Just try something different. It can even be just reading a different newspaper, watching a different news channel. One of the things that I have do that I love to help broaden my own experience is watching the BBC for my news, right?
Mhm.
As one of my news outlets, watching there are some things I learn about the United States by watching the BBC America that I don't learn by watching ABC, CBS, or NBC, right?
Yeah.
There was, a newspaper in Grand Rapids locally. I know this is for the Kent District, but I think you can find this online, but the Grand Rapids Times, right, is a Black produced newspaper. Just reading something different, even reading something different. Pick a novel, a historical novel that is told from the eyes of a woman or told from the eyes of a person of color, right? That's also a way of broadening your experience. But if you can get out there in community, look up best ethnic restaurants, whether it's my favorite out there is 40 Acres. I'm just going to give it a shout out. So that or Thai or whatever, look those up and go try the food. Go there to experience, not with the attitude of, oh, this is going to be weird, but go with, wow, I'm looking to find a new flavor that I like. I'm looking for a new favorite food. So that's something that I would say too. So, getting out there, broadening your experience. It could be, oh, and you know what you could do now to broaden your experience in the age of COVID, since so much is so virtual, for people who are Christ followers, believers, on Sunday morning, there's so many services that are streaming live. After your own regular service, find a service that is different than yours or a different faith community, not different faith, a different ethnic group, different racial group, and watch the service. You can watch it from the comfort of your own home, but even that is a way to broaden your experience. There's documentaries, there's movies, there's all kinds of things that you
Absolutely. And we have a lot of excellent anti-racism books here at the library. We have amazing book lists, so everyone please check those out.
Yes. Reading is good. Visit the library. They're more than willing to help you out in that. And there are podcasts and there are books. And just look at people in the community. Read with an eye. And I will tell you this, once you start trying to make yourself more aware of the disparities that are there, make yourself more aware of what's out there, you'll discover more. You'll find yourself saying, wow, I didn't know that. Wow, that is so interesting. Wow. So once you start making yourself aware, it's going to be almost like you're going to see it everywhere. My husband, so I'm a sociologist by training. My husband is not. And there are sometimes he'll say, I can't watch this movie with you because you're just going to call out all the stuff. I just want to watch the movie. It's just entertainment for him. It's a sociological exercise for me, but you'll just see it everywhere, right? You'll watch the news different. You'll say, well, why are they saying the racial identity of the Black people, but not for the white people?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Why are there pictures only of the Black people looking kind of shady, but the white people don't look so shady, right? You'll see that, and you'll notice that with some stations more than others. When you are aware, you see that, and find ways to listen to the stories of people and what they're experiencing. That's the best way to develop empathy for wanting to do something.
Yes, and we are all about kindness, empathy, and love here at KDL.
Yes. Well, yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you everyone for joining Michelle and me this evening. This is actually the second in our 4-part Live and Learn lecture series that takes place on Monday nights at 6 p.m. So next week, we're going to explore the topic of how we can build resilience and use mindful self-compassion, which is certainly a needed resource during these COVID times. So thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening.